So our first speaker today is Scott McMorrow, who is the CTO for Signal Integrity Products at Samtec. I met Scott several years ago, and I'm continually impressed by his technical expertise and his passion for engineering. Over the years, Scott has helped numerous companies develop high-performance products while training signal integrity engineers. In his current role, he continues being a problem solver and a change agent. Please welcome Scott McMorrow, our keynote speaker.
What a great crowd. So disclaimer first. I have a habit of using profanity, so if I do, I apologize. I'll try to tone it down. And I am passionate about this stuff. When I started in the field of electrical engineering, in 1980 was my first job. That's what I was called. I was an engineer. Today, I call myself a signal integrity engineer, an electromagnetic specialist, applied electromagnetic specialist. But the fact is, what I did then is no different than what I do now, which is just engineering. We've tended to specialize in things over the years and silo ourselves. But in fact, what I'm going to talk about today is broadening horizons. And the biggest, most broad horizon is being a change agent. And essentially, and I call it betting your job. And you know, some of you engineers in here, like me, know that sometimes we put a product out the door and we just go, how the hell is this ever going to work? And we literally hope and pray that everything we did was correct. When I was consulting, and I've been consulting for 25 years now, with a brief 1.5-year stint at Intel and then back into consulting, used to have jobs where I would give a quotation to the customer. And I used to call them "oh shit" quotes. And they were called that because if I got the bid and got a PO, the first thing I would say is, oh shit, I got to do this now. And I don't have the slightest idea how to do it. But I have confidence in the fact of my training and my abilities and my friends in the engineering community that I can bet my job. And as a consultant, and how many people in here actually own their own businesses? There's a few. So you guys know that every day you're betting your job. That whether you bring in business, whether you do right by your customers, you know that everything is on the line every day. I'm now back in the corporate world. I work for Samtec. I sold my company 4 years ago, and it was one of the best moves I've ever made. But it took me a 30-something year career to get to the point where I could do that. So what's the motivation for this talk is we're making the impossible possible. And the simplest, these are the obligatory internet slides. If you look down on the far left, that's a long time ago. This is essentially the data rate per second of IP traffic on the internet, historically since the early the 80s, I believe. Essentially, it was 0 compared to today. That scale is in gigabytes per second, I think. I can't read it from here. We're experiencing exponential growth. So everything that I'm doing today to bet my job and bet the company is on that growth right there. It hasn't abated. It keeps going. We keep needing to provide more and more bandwidth to end users all across the world. And there's no signs that it's stopping. If we just look at internet data growth, another obligatory slide, the data on the internet is growing at a 24% annual growth rate. Compound annual growth rate of 24%. When I saw those numbers, I thought, I've seen these before and I've kind of glossed over them. But now I kind of do marketing sometimes too. And so I need to know where, in order to help develop products, I need to know where things are going. That's an extreme growth rate, well beyond anything that the stock market has ever produced at any time in history. Now, we have that growth rate because, of course, we make products faster, cheaper, and so the industry follows that trend. The question is do we want to go incremental growth or do we want to innovate? So billion-dollar companies are places where innovation goes to die. It does. When they're started as a startup, they are always very innovative companies. You have to be in order to get into the market, to buy into the game. But once you become a billion-dollar company, now your job is to survive and provide a reasonable amount of growth over the years so you can satisfy the people that own your stocks, right? Billion-dollar companies are characterized by linear, non-disruptive, inside-the-box thinking. And I would guess that many of you work in companies like that. Lots of engineers do. In a way a friend of mine talks about this, they incrementally expand the current context. They don't think outside of what they're currently doing, except in a very, very limited way. You can look at the auto industry, the aerospace industry, the consumer goods industry, the electronics industry, telecommunications. Think about something like Coca-Cola Zero. What the heck is that? That's an incremental change. Flamin' Hot Cheetos, love those things. Best thing after a lot of drinking at a conference. It's one of my secret guilty pleasures, right? When I'm traveling. That is not an innovation. That is incremental growth. It's good incremental growth for me. So I'm going to talk about corporations a little bit here, and these are my thoughts. Perhaps, and a friend just taught me this. He taught me the power of the perhaps. Perhaps you might want to listen to my point of view, and if it makes sense, make it part of yours. So these are some quotes that sum up corporations. Number one, peace and tranquility is directly related to order and discipline. That's a paraphrase of John Calvin and the Calvinist philosophy and religion. And it permeates our society. Everything is about order and discipline. The way our legal system, our school systems, our business systems are all set up so that we can predict what's going to happen. That's actually a really good thing. It's good for incremental growth. It's not good for disruption. Disruption is always revolutionary. Politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best. Not the best. It's what you can do within the current context. And that's Bismarck. He was the first chancellor of Germany. And this is my quote, "We're all temporary employees." If you work for a corporation, you may think you have security. You don't. I have a saying. If you work for a corporation, you have the illusion of security. If you work for yourself, you have the illusion of freedom. They're both illusions. We're all temporary employees. So incremental improvement is characterized by Diet Coke versus Coke Zero. There actually are two products. There are two diet products. They taste a little bit different. They both have 1 calorie, but that's what corporations do. They eke the last penny out of the design, out of the innovation was Coke. That happened in the 1800s. They haven't innovated since. right? That was the disruption, was that drink. And of course, at the time, the disruption was the fact that it actually had cocaine in it. And so it was much more pleasurable than it is now. So billion-dollar ideas, they're built on innovation. They're nonlinear. You never know where they're going to come from. They are disruptive. They're outside-the-box thinking. They expand the operating context. It's when everything else has been exhausted and you get into a different space, a different frame of mind. As a person, as a company, as a society, shit happens. And it happens fast. The internet was one of those things. That was actually innovation that was funded by the government. Who knew? But it can happen. Personal computers. Remember the amazing thing that happened when the IBM, if those of you that were around and actually used an IBM personal computer. There were other computers just as good. In fact, better at the time. And in fact, the IBM PC was, what's the engineering term? Oh, a piece of crap. It really was bad engineering. But it was done by a group in Boca Raton, in IBM, outside of the normal chain of command, as a Skunk Works project. And it became the innovation of essentially the last 3 decades. Think about that. Something very simple like that. These were people that went and did what they could do, and they came up with a product that revolutionized the industry. And then, of course, now IBM, again being a multi-billion-dollar company, is back to incremental change, right? So they made one change at that point. It then became incremental, and they've sold off all of their personal computer lines. The iPhone, the Tesla, SpaceX, Uber, the biotech revolution. All of those things are examples of disruptive technologies that are built on innovation that required people to go outside of the normal bounds, and in many cases to bet their jobs on them. The thing about people that create companies that is often different than engineers. Engineers, we know how to do stuff. People that are entrepreneurs that build companies are willing to risk everything to do stuff. It's the only difference. And then they find engineers that'll follow along, right? It's seldom that an engineer will actually start a company that is hugely disruptive. But when you have one that does, it does amazing things. Hewlett-Packard is an example. A very disruptive company at the time. Now they're just a corporation and spread out. So 3 quotes that sum up billion-dollar ideas. Number 1, it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to get permission. That's Rear Admiral Grace Murray Hopper. Anyone know who she is? She's one of the first programmers. She is the inventor of the compiler. She was a Yale mathematician, went into the Navy, and programmed the Mark I computer, the Harvard Mark I. Also, down there at the right corner is a sheet from her lab notebook. That's a moth. That was caught in the relay of the Harvard Mark I computer. And that is, in computer lore, that is considered the first computer bug. At least the Navy would like us to believe that. Whether it was or not, she was a feminist engineer, mathematician, that was absolutely amazing and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral at a time when women had absolutely no power pretty much anywhere in the United States. So it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission. Richard Feynman, a great, I love Feynman. What do you care what other people think is the title of his book. Talking about essentially disruption. A lot of things, engineers tend to be very introverted. We tend to think things through too much. But disruption doesn't happen by being introverted. It happens by not caring about what other people think and doing what you think is right. And finally, my quote is, bet your job. Do it every day. Do it in everything that you do. And there's an example of innovation. I remember being in grade school watching Shepard fly, seeing the first space flights, seeing the lunar landing on television, listening to Cronkite. And I watch these SpaceX launches and videos, and I get tears in my eyes because this takes me back to that time when that truly was a disruptive, innovative event. And this is too. The idea of reusable rockets has been talked about for years. Nobody ever had the guts to do it. This guy is doing it and disrupting the entire aerospace industry right now. It's killing the United Launch Alliance and some of the other heavy launch vehicles. And I was not a fan of Elon Musk because I thought he was an arrogant ass. But he's our arrogant ass, and he's disruptive, and he's really he's good at motivating people. And of course, I love the name of the drone ships that they land on. And this one is, Of Course I Still Love You, which is an allusion to a science fiction ship in a science fiction novel. So why should you bet your job? Because you could crap out. So in 2001, 9/11, the entire electronics industry was disrupted. The entire financial industry was disrupted. And for the next several years, the amount of industry and the amount of jobs and the amount of consulting opportunities went to near zero. And so in the next year, in 2002, I was working, trying to make ends meet, trying to get consulting through another consulting company, couldn't get much. And so I was borrowing out of my 401k, and it was leaking like a sieve. And at one point, I turned to my wife, and we sat and talked, and I said, I think I'd like to start a consulting company of my own. She goes, okay. And we talked about it, and we decided, well, I could start a company, and we could lose absolutely everything. Or we could continue to drain our 401k and lose absolutely everything that we have made. Or we could take that and put that into the new company. And what's the worst thing that could happen? We lived in Portland, Oregon at the time. We'd have to get up, leave, lick our wounds, and I'd have to get a real job somewhere. I don't work well with other people, so it's not normally an option. That's why I work in Maine out of my home. You say, well, yeah, I want to bet my job, but I really like my employer. Oh, you're welcome to. In fact, you're supposed to. You're supposed to like your employer because order and discipline is necessary for the company to keep employees from getting too far out of line. You're supposed to not like to rock the boat. That's exactly where they want you. All corporations are like this. They also like disruptors, but you have to be a sneaky disruptor. You have to be good, but you have to be right, and you have to stick to it. And remember that, and you all know this, running a company is a political process. Watch your managers, watch the vice presidents, watch the directors, watch the politics that goes on. You don't have any voice in that. I learned that a long time ago. I got no voice in what happens in the company unless I can bet my job and become part of that voice. There's exceptions, but there are very few exceptions. Musk's company, Tesla, he just wrote a memo about siloing, the idea that in most companies information is siloed. In Tesla, they are encouraged to share and communicate information to the person and the place that most needs it, going around bosses, going around managers. Not sure how well that works, but that in practice is a good thing, getting information going in multiple places. And remember, we're all temporary employees, so no matter how loyal you are to your company, you're one layoff away from working for another company. So when I began my career, many engineers found that employment, people did have employment for life. At least they believed that. Bell Labs was founded on that, right? If you worked at Bell Labs, you're going to be at Bell Labs for life. Well, yeah, no. Actually, that's not the case, because they became Lucent, became Alcatel, became Nokia Alcatel. DEC was one of those companies that people thought they were going to work at for life. The personal computer industry, the disruption, devastated DEC. IBM, they're kind of the exception that proves the rule. You can work at IBM for life. I'm sure it's a great place to work. I get the creeps whenever I go into an IBM building. That's just me. One day I was at Intel, and I was walking in, and I'd forgotten my badge, and I picked up a temporary badge, and this is where my saying comes from. One of the guys coming in next to me laughed at me, saying, "Oh, you're temporary," and I just looked at him and I go, "You don't understand. We're all temporary." So how many of you today believe you'll continue to work at your current employer until you retire? Yeah, not many. So you might as well start betting. If you have the fortitude and the ability to do it, it might behoove you to start betting your job more and acting like you're betting a job. Engineers are truth tellers. You have truth that nobody else has, and quite frankly, nobody really wants to listen to you because it's often so esoteric that they can't understand it. You have to learn how to tell it, learn how to communicate it. Eric's sitting here, and he's learned how to do that. He doesn't do a lot of engineering. He does a lot of truth telling, though. He gets other people to do it. He's got students now. But we all believe we're the smartest people in the room, or at least close to the smartest people in the room. But there's other people in marketing, in sales, and in management that think they're the smartest people in the room, and they have an advantage over us. They're extroverts. They like politics. They like power. We'd rather be working on a problem. So to be heard, you have to rise up above that. So how do you get to a $1 billion idea? Well, maybe it's only a $100 million idea, but that's a lot of money, and that makes a difference to your company's bottom line, your compensation, your worth in the industry, or your own ego. Engineers are ego-driven often. We just like to solve interesting, neat problems that nobody else has solved. So would you like to be the person that enables that idea? Or the person that didn't say anything, who disagreed and committed? That's an Intel term, rather than fighting against a bad idea. I consulted for Intel back in the 90s on Rambus. They had designed an entire processor architecture around the Rambus memory chip, which had a really funky reflected wave bus architecture that was prone to resonance and had an extremely long latency, which means they had to they had to change their entire architecture to allow extremely deep pipes in the processor. Rambus didn't work except for a few chips in very short channels. Well, I kept going into meetings going, this doesn't work, guys. Oh, yeah, no, we've tested it, it works. Yeah, there were 2 guys in Intel Labs, that really knew anything about Rambus, and it actually simulated. The rest had gone along with the program. There wasn't anybody else in Intel that was able to go and say, this is an absolutely horrid, stupid idea, and do it at the time that it would have changed the processor architecture. That period in time, remember when when AMD was riding high with the Athlon processor? They were kicking Intel's ass in the industry because Intel had architected a processor that just didn't work and perform well because it had to work with RAM bus, and they had to switch to SDRAM. They lost an entire processor generation, and that was the only reason why AMD's alive today, was because of that. Or do you want to be the person, and this is typical engineer behavior, who complains afterwards that they knew it wasn't going to work? But they, I'm sorry, they didn't frickin' come and tell me or tell management that it wasn't going to work or do it in a way that was communicated well. They kept quiet, and they were whiners and complainers. And I hate whiners and complainers, and I've done a lot of that in my life. So I see that in me. That's something that I do also, so I can recognize it. So how many ideas have been lost? How much economy has been lost because engineers didn't speak up? I was riding through Colorado. I was a sales engineer, application engineer for monolithic memories, the PAL guys, programmable logic, back in the 80s when the Challenger disaster happened. We were right near the Morton Thiokol plant, and I said to my sales guy, some engineer really fucked up on this one. And that's what happened. An engineer failed to follow up and follow up and follow up and go to higher and higher management to insist that those O-rings should not be flown at low temperatures. It was Feynman that actually proved it in the middle of a meeting with politically correct, order and discipline people, and he had his assistants come in, took an O-ring, had frozen it, put it on the table, had a ball-peen hammer, he smashed it and it shattered. The story was over. That was it. That was the point at which they believed that it was the O-rings that were causing the problem. So as a CTO of a company, CTO, I don't have any responsibility except to push people in the right directions, to kibitz on things, to give advice and suggest ideas. I want people to challenge me. I want them to come up and say, I think you're wrong. And then I want to discuss it. And I'm a hard ass. I'm going to come back at you hard, and I want you to come back and tell me. And if you believe your convictions and you have the data and facts to back it up, I want you to come to me and tell me that that's the case. Convince me that I'm wrong. I am wrong sometimes, and I admit it when I am. I want engineers and I want all people to think through every problem and decision as if your job was on the line. There are so many engineers that want to push a button. Well, I got to do one more simulation. I got to do one more calculation. I got to do one more of this. Where I was raised and where I went to school, we didn't have calculators. We had slide rules. My first engineering class was essentially a class in how do I approximate things? How do I guess the right answer and develop an intuition? I want engineers to develop that gut level intuition. That this is what, you should never run an experiment. You should never do anything without knowing what you believe the answer should be. And if it's not what you expect, then you've learned something. You've learned a new phenomenon. You've learned something you didn't know, or you may have discovered something. I've discovered a lot of things in my career. A lot of you have. But I want people to make their decisions, and I want people to bet their jobs on them, because that's the way engineering advances. That's the way we personally advance. We're going to bet our job. We're going to, if you're a family man and you've got a family, every day you're betting on the job of being a father. Why wouldn't you do that in your work, which you spend, for many of us, we spend more time at work than we do with our families. It's one of the most important things that we as engineers do. And always remember that the next good idea could come from anybody in here, or you could be the person that enables somebody to to facilitate that idea. And to me, that's important. I've watched the engineering, I've watched the industry, and I've watched as companies grow larger and become boring. I've watched innovative companies come up and be taken, be sold, and become dissipated. And then I've seen entrepreneurs that do amazing things with the technology. And that's my wish for everybody, is to develop that intuition, to bet your job, and to engineer like you really love it, rather than it being just a job. Thanks.